Good afternoon, Brother Dwayne, and all of you in attendance this afternoon. I'm very honored to be invited to participate in this conference and to share with you some of my own thoughts. I do understand your question to me was how do I, or did I understand Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 when I was a Protestant, and how would that compare to today? And also, I guess, whether all images are idols. And we'll talk about some of these things as I launch into my presentation. But first of all, Dwayne, as you know, up until 2016, I was a Protestant. I was born into a Baptist family and received a license to preach from my American Baptist church and preached for almost 20 years in different churches as a lay minister. I was not a paid full-time pastor, but I preached on the side for free to help congregations out. I worked a lot with the Vietnamese people and went to seminary, to Fuller Seminary, and got a master's degree in theology and Bible from Fuller Seminary. And interestingly, the more I studied, the more I realized that the Catholics were not as wrong as I thought they were. And I became a student of church history. There was one famous Catholic that said to be a student of church history is to cease to be non-Catholic. But anyway, I had a similar kind of a growth during my seminary years, and eventually in 2015, the Holy Spirit called me specifically and said, stop preaching in the Protestant churches and become a Catholic. And I struggled with that for a year, and after a year of struggling, I was obedient in January 2016 and then entered the Catholic Church through the RCIA ministries in 2016 Easter Vigil. The church, because of my Bible background and ministerial experience, quickly put me in charge of the RCIA program at our parish. So these days I serve as a coordinator for RCIA for St. Mel Parish in Fair Oaks, California. And what that means is I teach Protestants or new believers, people that don't know anything, or people with a Protestant background, how to become Catholic and answer their questions. So with that in mind, I would like to address Exodus 24, because that is one of the objections that some Protestants have against the Catholic Church. And you do have to realize, Dwayne, that Protestants, there's thousands of denominations, and we came in every different flavor, ranging from the most extreme, virulent anti-Catholics that it seems like they would see what does the Catholic Church believe, and we believe the opposite, all the way to Protestants that almost are Catholic and just vary on small things. I would say that by and large, American Baptists are probably more here than maybe Filipino Baptists, which may still be over here because they're differentiating themselves from the Catholic Church, which is the dominant religion in the Philippines, where American Baptists have been around for hundreds of years and they've been dominant. And so over time, they have grown closer to the Catholic Church on some issues. And one of those being the use of images in church. So without further ado, I'd like to launch into a PowerPoint presentation that I have prepared. And let me go ahead and get into this PowerPoint presentation. And the question is essentially, how should we look at Exodus 24? It's the scripture that prohibits the making of graven images. Sometimes in the United States, and I'm sure in the Philippines, you've seen very simple lists of the Ten Commandments. And when you look at a Protestant list, Exodus 20 verse 4 appears in the second commandment, which says, thou shalt not make any graven images. And so the question becomes, does the Catholic Church violate this commandment? We'll see that perhaps this verse doesn't even make up its own commandment if we look at it from a Catholic perspective, but we also need to look at it from a Protestant perspective. So the Protestant second commandment, you shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. That's taken straight out of the Bible, Exodus 20, verse 4, and it seems to prohibit making a carved image of anything for any reason. And I asked the question, really? Because sometimes you can take things, you take a single sentence and it seems to be very broad, but it doesn't really mean that, because you have to look at it in context. If we were to take things absolutely broadly about no graven images, then these Baptist churches here at the First Baptist Church that have the manger scene would be violating the second commandment, because those are graven images of Jesus and Mary and Joseph and angels that appeared in history on the first Christmas, and they would seem to violate that Second Amendment. Or this Baptist church over here that I found, when the churches that I ministered at as a Baptist, a lot of times we would have crosses with grave clothes symbolizing the resurrection. And while it's not an image of a person or an animal, it is an image of a thing that's on the earth that appeared in history. And are these in violation of Exodus 24 if you take an extreme literal view of that sentence? Or how about secular statues? We've got Abraham Lincoln here. You can find it in Washington, D.C., or this famous Filipino statue here, or the governments of the United States and the Philippines violating Exodus 20, verse 4, if you look at it in a very extreme and literal sense. And evidently so, if you only read that one sentence verse out of context, because any likeness of anything is prohibited by the very plain words of that sentence. So the problem is that sentences that come in context, and you have to look at the whole Bible, not just a single verse to come up with your theology. And, we had situations in the Bible very soon after God gave Moses the Ten Commandments, where God told Moses to do things that seemingly violate the strict literal interpretation of Exodus 20, verse 4, taken out of context. For instance, Numbers 21:8, the Lord said to Moses, make a fiery serpent and set it on a pole, and everyone who is bitten when he sees it shall live. Remember, God told Moses to make on a stick a graven image of a serpent, and as people were walking through the desert getting bit by snakes, he said they would look at that pole and receive healing. And so it not only was an image, but it had kind of a sacramental power to it. And yet he said that right after telling Moses not to let the people make graven images. So what's going on there? And then in Exodus 25, God, in instructing Moses how to make his tabernacle, tells him, and thou shalt make a mercy seat of pure gold, 2 cubits and a half in the length thereof, and 1.5 cubits is the breadth. And thou shalt make 2 cherubims of gold, of beaten work shalt thou make them, in the 2 ends of the mercy seat. And it goes on to talk about how they would have wings extending towards each other. And that clearly is a graven image of a thing in heaven. So why would God be telling Moses to break the second commandment? And of course, he wasn't, because perhaps the second commandment does not only mean that one sentence and taken in a literalistic point of view. Perhaps our understanding of the commandment is wrong. So we have a saying that says reading verses out of context is a pretext, or verses without a context is a pretext. So Catholics understand Exodus 24 is not a standalone sentence making up the second commandment, but must be read with Exodus chapter 20, verses 3 and 5 as the first commandment. Of course, our Catholic commandments, as we'll see in a later slide, come out of the book of Deuteronomy, which is a restatement of what's in Exodus, but the concept is the same, that the first Catholic commandment is not split into 2 as with the Protestants. So here you said, verse 4, you shall not make for yourself an image, but you read that in context of verse 3, you shall have no other gods before me, and also read it in context of verse 5, you shall not bow down to them what? The graven images. For I, the Lord, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sins of the parent, et cetera, et cetera. So, when we look at all of these verses together, we see that the reason you don't make a graven image of something is so that you won't bow down to it and worship it, and standing for a God which you're putting before the real God. So essentially, Jehovah God is saying that, I'm God. You're not going to have any other gods. Don't make a fake God and worship him. He's not saying don't make a statue of Abraham Lincoln to remember the 16th president of the United States, or don't make a war statue to commemorate the valor of people in wars, or even saying don't make a manger scene of Jesus and Mary, because you're not worshiping those in exclusion to God. You're remembering an event that God caused to happen. So looking at Exodus 24 by itself seems to be a strict prohibition of sculpting anything for any reason, but looking at it together, we see that God is not trying to prevent the making of images, but to prohibit the worship of images instead of himself. And I would also throw in, we had the instance in the desert where Aaron made a golden calf that represented Jehovah God, and that also was a big no-no. They weren't worshiping the calf instead of God. They were saying that God was represented by the calf, and God the Father, of course, is spirit, and nothing can contain him. So some of this prohibition against images was reducing God to a physical thing, when at that time he was spirit, and God was trying to emphasize this to the Jews. That changes a little bit when God comes in the flesh, and the Bible said that Jesus is the icon or the image of God, and we see God become incarnate, become flesh, and so that reason for not carving images commemorating God disappears. It might still pertain to trying to make a statue of God the Father, but certainly there's nothing wrong with making a statue of God the Son. Anyway, one of your questions, Dwayne, was as a Baptist minister, how did I understand that verse, Exodus 24? I did not read it as a Baptist literally, as I've been teaching against here. I understood that the prohibition was against idols, and not all statues are idols. I knew that. And I had no problem with having garden statues, for instance. Here's a statue of Jesus that I put on the front of my first book as a Protestant pastor. And that statue was in my backyard. So no problem with Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, no problem with St. Francis in my garden, no problem with Mary or any other Christmas nativity statues, because I understood the difference between statues that remind us of the things of God and idols that you worship instead of God. So that was not my problem. One of the things I did not understand as a Baptist minister, and really didn't realize it till I was in RCIA, teaching RCIA, was that there are a different set, and maybe some of you don't know this, a different set of 10 commandments for Catholics and Protestants. And actually, the Jews have their own set of 10 commandments, which is different than the Catholics and the Protestants. And different Protestant faith traditions also kind of number them differently. The reason for that is that there's actually, if you read these sections in Exodus chapter 20 or Deuteronomy chapter 5, there's actually 14 commandments, not 10. And so, and nowhere does Moses say God is giving us 10 commandments. He just tells us what God says not to do. And for ease of memory, people and faith traditions have put those groups of 14 commandments into sets of 10. And as we've seen in our discussion, the you shall not make a graven image really should be put together with the other commandment to not have any other gods beside me, to make a single commandment so we can understand it in context. But here, the Protestant first 4 commandments differ a little bit than the Catholic first 4. And also a difference is the Protestants take their commandments from Exodus chapter 20 And the Catholics take their wording of the commandments from Deuteronomy chapter 5, and that's two different books in the Bible that restate the same thing, but in slightly different language. But the first commandment for Protestants, you shall have no other God before me. That's from Exodus 23. The Catholics say, I, the Lord, am your God. And that's that's the Jewish commandment, first commandment, and you shall have no other God beside me. And that would be the Jewish second commandment, but the Catholics combine that into one, and they take the wording from Deuteronomy 5, 7 through 10. The Protestants then have a second commandment, which says, do not make graven images unto yourselves. And that is part of the Catholic first commandment, because you read Deuteronomy 7 through 10 or Exodus 23 through 5, as we had on a prior screen. We have, I, the Lord, your God, and your God, you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make any graven images, and you shall not worship them. And so all of this is part of the same prohibition of exchanging the real God for a fake God, and you're not supposed to do that. So Catholic first command, Protestants have two commands, and then it tracks on the second command in Catholic, not taking the name of the Lord's God in vain. Third Protestant, same. The fourth Protestant, keep the Sabbath holy. That's the same as the third Catholic. And then the Catholics move on. Well, how do the Catholics come up with 10 when they lost the second Protestant commandment? It's because in the Protestant commandments, it just says, thou shalt not covet. And it goes on, don't covet your neighbor's wife and don't covet his property. And that's two different commands. The Protestants make that one, the Catholics make it two, and voila, you have 10 commandments on either side. So bottom line is that I believe that the Catholic way of numbering it is good because basically it shows that second commandment about not making and then worshiping graven images is really part of the first. I first became aware of these two sets of commandments when one of my Baptist friends told me that the Catholics changed the 10 commandments in order to take away the second commandment, in order to cover up the fact that we were violating the second commandment. And that's when I did the research on the 10 commandments to find out, well, first of all, the Catholics, we didn't change the 10 commandments. We were here first. For 1,500 years, the Catholic Church and St. Augustine used this version, the Catholic version, and it's based pretty much on the Jewish version. The Jewish version also includes graven images with the no other gods before me. And so we didn't hide a commandment. The Protestants just divided it up differently in order to emphasize perhaps something that they didn't agree with that the church was doing at the time, which was the use of images in liturgy. Well, as a Baptist minister, I did not understand the Catholic distinction between veneration and worship. The Bible clearly says, you shall not bow down to them or worship them. And I always felt uneasy, not the use of Catholic statues in church. I had no problem with Joseph and Mary, but I did have a problem and felt uneasy when I would see Catholics bow before the statues and kiss them and pray before them, and because that did seem to violate the second commandment as I understood it. And yet, I did not feel uneasy seeing mothers kiss pictures of their children or patriots standing up and putting their hands over their heart during the Pledge of Allegiance, or seeing Japanese bow to each other as a sign of respect, even though those could all be deemed violating the Protestant second commandment as well. So it was a matter of culture, things that I came to understand as a Catholic, that Catholics differentiate between veneration and showing respect and worship. So to a Catholic, respecting a statue because it stands for something is not the same as worshiping it. So bowing before a statue or bowing before the altar or bowing before different things is to show the Bible, doing the sign of the cross before the Bible. We're not worshiping the Bible, but we are venerating the Bible. We're showing respect because it stands for something important. Catholics make a difference. We use some Greek words to differentiate between veneration and worship. We use the word doulia in Greek, which literally means service or respect. And it's the kind of respect that can be to man. And we use doulia for the saints, for St. Paul, for St. Joseph, for St. Christopher. We respect the saints. We don't worship saints, as we're accused of doing sometimes, but we pray to them, not as a worship, but in asking them to intercede for us. So we have the concept of the intercession of the saints, that we can pray to a saint and say, please pray for me, just like I could ask you, Brother Dwayne, to pray for me as well. And we have this doulia that we do for the saints. For Mary, we have a hyperdulia. It's a respect on steroids. It's not worship, it's respect, but it's a respect on steroids. It's hyperdulia. It's the kind of respect that we show to the woman who bore God in her womb and who made possible the plan of salvation by her yes. And then finally, we have worship, latria, which is due to the Trinity alone, which is what Exodus 20, verses 1 through 5 is talking about. So we respect Mary and the saints and can ask them to pray for us, but we're not worshiping them because we understand they're on the same team as God. They're his subordinates, and we're not replacing him or putting them before him. One of the last things that I had as a struggle becoming a Catholic, when God was telling me to become a Catholic, is I just, had a real hang up with the Virgin Mary and the hyperdulia. I had a hard time distinguishing between hyperdulia and worship, and seeing the amount of devotion that Catholics had to Mary. And I always saw her as kind of like Santa Claus. Santa Claus kind of replaced Jesus at Christmas in the secular culture. And it wasn't until I studied about the Virgin of Guadalupe and how her appearance brought 10 million Aztecs to Christianity back in the 1500s that the light bulb turned on in my head and said, Mary's not in competition with Jesus. She's on the same side as Jesus. She's bringing people to Jesus. And the only thing she really says is do whatever he tells you. And that's the proper way of viewing Mary. And when I saw that she wasn't replacing Christ, but on his side and subordinate, as were all the saints, it was then that I could finally obey God and become a Catholic. But again, I warn all of you, this conference is about reaching out to others and understanding them. To an outsider who doesn't know Catholic distinctions, dulia and hyperdulia can look like worship. And not only that, I think that sometimes maybe some of our own people in the pews that haven't studied Greek and haven't studied, Exodus 24 and other things can lose sight of that as well, and by their attitudes and their behaviors, perhaps blur the distinction between dulia and latria. And we see this in the Bible. Remember, I used as an example that God told Moses that he could make a graven image and put it on a stick to save people from snake bites. But fast forward a number of generations to the time of King Hezekiah, and we get here this verse in 2 Kings 18:4 that he removed the high places, smashed the sacred stones, and cut down the Asherah poles. He broke into pieces the bronze snake that Moses had made. This is the snake that God told Moses to make. For up to that time, the Israelites had been burning incense to it. They were sacrificing to it. It was called Nehushtan. And so what started as something holy and allowed became blurred over time. People were sacrificing to it and worshiping it instead of realizing it was a tool of the one true God for their salvation. And at that time, God allowed, or perhaps prompted, King Hezekiah to destroy that thing. So things to watch out for as we make that distinction to our Protestant brothers and tell them that they're wrong, that we're not breaking the second commandment, is let's just make sure we're wrong and we're not breaking the first commandment, that we're not wrong and not breaking the first commandment. And always instruct our people to not blur the distinction between asking Mary for intercession and praying to her as if she had the power of God, or for some of the other superstitious practices that I've seen with statues and medallions, thinking they have luck or power on their own. We just need to be careful with these things because Exodus 24 is not prohibiting us to have statues in our churches or to venerate them or to pray to the saints and ask for intercession, but it does prohibit us from bowing to the statues as if they were God and as if they had power instead of God. And so we do not teach that in the Catholic Church, but sometimes it seems like people practice that. And so that type of catechesis needs to be employed in our parishes so that the Baptists are not correct in their criticism of the one true Catholic, Holy, and Apostolic Church. And so that's what I have to say on these items today, Dwayne, and thank you for allowing me to be with you in this recording. So if you have anything else, I appreciate it. So once again, thank you for letting me be with you.